In part 1 of this video, we looked at the importance of sharpening in Lightroom or other raw conversion software. In this part 2, we're looking at adding creative sharpening using some special tools in Photoshop. Now, the next two enhancements that I'm going to demonstrate come under the heading of creative sharpening, and these may or may not be applied to all of your images, but this is designed to give you an idea of what is possible within Photoshop. And what I've done is I've created a new layer here that I've applied this technique to, but let's come back and have a look at how we do this. So with our image worked through Topaz with that denoise and sharpening applied, we've got a pretty good image, but we can now apply some creative sharpening using one of Photoshop's filters, and we'll go up into the filters dialog box. We'll come down to the sharpen option, and we will go down to unsharp mask. Now, this form of sharpening that we're going to apply is not your typical sharpening. This is designed to give a little bit more of a mid-tone contrast boost, and we call that selective sharpening or mid-tone sharpening. And what we do is we apply a very small value of sharpening of 25, and we apply this at a radius of 25 pixels, whereas normally in our sharpening in Lightroom we would never use anything more than 1 pixel radius. Here we're using a very wide radius, a very small amount, and we're leaving the threshold at 2 levels of difference in tone, so that we're not necessarily going to be sharpening or adding contrast to areas where there's very little difference in tone. And so once we click OK with that option, it will generate the selective sharpening, and we can see how that applies now. And I've actually applied this on another layer, so we can just quickly click on this layer and zoom in. Let's go back to 100% and let's see what the difference is. If we go back to our sharpening and noise reduction in Lightroom, and now with those 2 further steps applied, the Topaz denoise and the selective sharpening, this is it turned on. You can see now we've got quite a lot of definition and separation with these elements in the center, and without it, it's lacking a lot. And there's one further step we can do, and that is we can use a high pass sharpening, which again enhances some of the fine detail. Now, to do this, you need to make a new composite copy of all that's gone below that. So to do that, you would use the keyboard shortcut Control, Shift, Alt and E to create a new composite layer, which you will see here. It's called Layer 1. And what we do now is we go up to the Photoshop filters, and we come down to the ones very creatively called Other, and what we want is the high pass filter. And when you turn this on, you'll initially be horrified because all you see is pretty much a grey background. Now, what we wanted to work with here is a radius of around 2 pixels. We don't need anything less than that. We don't really want anything more than that. If you see, if we go down to a very low radius, there is nothing there. If we go up to a very large radius amount, we've also got pretty much nothing happening. What we want is a radius of 2 pixels. So if we select 2 pixels and click OK, this is what we've got. Now, this looks pretty unimpressive, but what we need to do now is to change the blending mode from normal to overlay blend mode. And let's just zoom back in and have a look at the effect of this on our image. You can see that it adds a little more contrast again, but by the same token, it's starting to introduce a little bit of that noise back into the image. So we would just moderate that by reducing the opacity to maybe 50%, and so we've just got a little bit of added contrast back into the image, and we now have an image that's as sharp as it can possibly be. And one thing to remember when we're looking at these images is that you wouldn't necessarily apply all of these techniques to all images. I'm using this as an example to show what alternatives there are available. But if you want a really crisp image that requires a lot of fine detail, these techniques will work for you. And of course, you can always apply them selectively to the image by using a layer mask and selectively applying them only where you want them. Okay, we've had a look at an image that had a fairly high ISO setting and therefore needed a fair bit of noise reduction. Let's now have a look at another image that was taken some time ago, and that is of a giant petrel in Antarctica, or in fact in South Georgia, which is an island just near the Antarctic convergence. Now this was taken a few years ago, and it was taken on a Nikon D300 with an 80-400 zoom lens, which was a very nice lens, lovely and sharp. And so this image has been cropped a little bit, and we can see the effect here. This is the image without any sharpening applied in Lightroom, and so let's just zoom into 100%. I won't go through the steps in Lightroom because we've seen that already, but let's just see what happens when we apply a little bit of sharpening and bring out the fine detail. Firstly, let's have a look at the difference between applying the noise reduction and sharpening in Lightroom. It was shot at about 300 ISO, so not a very high ISO setting, and I know that the image was sharp and no movement detected. So looking at this, you can see that applying Lightroom's sharpening and noise reduction really does start to bring out some of the finer details in these feathers. If I turn that back on, you'll see a little bit more detail coming through here, but of course we can do a little more. So if we go back to our option of using Topaz as a plugin, I've used an example here of taking that Lightroom sharpened image and then applying the Topaz Sharpen AI filter to it, and it certainly does improve the detail a little bit more. But it does seem to creep in maybe a little bit more noise than I would like. So leaving that aside, let's just go back and take that same file and apply the Topaz denoise. And again, using denoise, we can apply sharpening and bring out fine detail. And I actually prefer this option. You'll see here that I've actually applied a mask to this version of the image because I don't want to sharpen this out of focus background. I'm really only interested in sharpening up the details on this bird. And if we turn that off again, and we can see a little bit more detail coming in around the eye and all these fine details within the feathers. So let's just take it one step further and look at that selective sharpening using the 25-25-2 setting. And if we apply that, you'll see again it's applying a little more mid-tone contrast, just helping to enhance some of these details in the feathers. And lastly, going back to our denoise and high pass filter, that again at reduced opacity can add a little bit more detail. It might be getting to the point of having too much sharpening applied, but you've got the option then of deciding. And if we come back to fit that on screen, we can see that this bird now absolutely jumps out of the page. And if we apply a little bit of tonal adjustment to the background by darkening it down, it really does help to stand out. So let's have a look at that as it was originally. No sharpening and no noise reduction, and the final image you can see much more detail. And if we zoom into 50% to have a look at that, we can really see how this has improved the image out of sight. And this was on a 12 megapixel sensor, and the image has been cropped a little bit to exclude some unwanted areas, but this image now looks beautifully sharp, and again it was correctly focused in the first place. Now we looked at this image of the gorilla a little earlier, and we said that there was a bit of an issue here in that there was a little bit of movement. Now here's the image opened in Photoshop without any noise reduction or sharpening applied. Let's just zoom back into 50%, and you can see here that as we saw in Lightroom, there's quite a lot of noise, and if you look carefully there's just a hint of a little bit of movement. So again, working on a different layer, I've applied the Lightroom sharpening and noise reduction, and that certainly does get rid of a lot of the noise out of the image and still retains most of the detail. But now here's an issue that we have, and that is we have that little bit of movement. How can we get rid of that? Well, there's a couple of different ways we can do that. Firstly, we can use Photoshop's shake reduction option, and that is one that most people don't even know about. So I created another copy of that layer, but let's just have a look at how we find that filter. If we go to filter, we better turn the layer on, otherwise we can't access the filter. Filter, sharpen, and the very first option under sharpen is shake reduction. And when you activate this filter, Photoshop looks at the image and tries to find areas of movement and works out a way to correct that movement. It does take a little bit of a time to render the image, and what it will do is it will generate automatically a sampling point. Now this is a version I've already used the shake reduction on, so I won't do this again, but you can draw in a number of other points to sample from and allow it to work out the movement in the image. Now this works well when there's just a very slight amount of movement. Once it's finished calculating the amount of movement based on these different boxes that we draw on the image, it will try and reverse that slight shake in the image. I'll cancel out of that now because it does take a few minutes to process. And if we turn this on and off, that is now off, and that is with the shake reduction applied. You'll see that it is actually done a pretty good job of reversing that little bit of movement. Now the other option would be to go to something like Topaz Sharpen AI, and if I turn off the Photoshop version, I turn on the Topaz Sharpen AI, I think that actually Photoshop has done a slightly better job in this case. May not always be the case, but in this instance I think Photoshop did a better job. One thing with the Topaz Sharpen AI, you need to go and have a shower, do the washing, mow the lawns, and then come back and it will probably have finished processing. It takes quite a long time, even with a computer with fairly powerful memory. It does use a lot of memory power to calculate the sharpening. So I think that the Sharpen AI is not as good as the Photoshop shake reduction, but we can do a little bit more. What happens if we ignored the Photoshop shake reduction, just used our old friend Topaz denoise? Well, it certainly does help a little bit with the sharpness, but you see it can't correct that little bit of movement in the image. So we'll stick with Photoshop's shake reduction, and let's say, what about the Sharpen AI and denoise? Well, it's still not as good as Photoshop's shake reduction, so we'll stick with that. And I took the Photoshop shake reduction version and then applied denoise to it, and I can barely see any noticeable difference. It is so minute it's almost undetectable, so it really isn't doing anything that's going to help this image any more than using Photoshop's shake reduction formula. And in this image, another way to apply a little bit more sharpening and detail is to use something like Nik Silver Effects. I've used this because I wanted this image to be a monochrome image, because the colors in the background were a bit distracting, and I just thought that this was a much better image to work with. So using Nik Silver Effects, using the high structure harsh filter, you'll see that it's again added a little bit more fine structure into the image. It may be verging on too sharp, but let's see what we can do. And once having applied that, doing a few tonal adjustments for the background to reduce some distractions, and maybe just adding a tiny little bit of light back into the eyes of the gorilla, we're getting pretty close. But then what would happen if we applied the high pass filter? We might be getting to the point where we've gone too far, and if this image was to be printed very large, you might get away with it, but I think adding the high pass as well is going to be too much, and so I think we're better off sticking with just a selective amount of sharpening and using that Photoshop D-shake to get rid of that slight movement in the image. Okay, we've had a look at an image that had a little bit of movement in it, and we've seen how we can correct that largely using that filter in Photoshop. But let's go back now and look at a landscape image that was taken on a tripod, uh, correctly focused, critically focused using live view, and in theory everything should be perfect. And so here's a version of the image without anything applied in Lightroom, no noise reduction, no sharpening, and if we zoom into 50% we can see that the image looks pretty reasonable. It's nice and sharp. What can we do to enhance that? Well, firstly, let's go in and add Lightroom's sharpening, and in this case no noise reduction necessary. It was taken at 64 ISO, the native resolution or the native ISO setting on the D850, and so using Lightroom's sharpening on its own certainly does make a difference. And then what would happen if we went to our old friend Topaz Denoise on top of the Lightroom sharpened image? Well, we can see that if we go in even tighter at 100%, the denoise version actually adds even more sharpening and brings out some of that fine structure even more critically than just Lightroom alone. And well, let's go in and try our old selective sharpening 25-25-2, and you'll see that it's actually adding quite a lot of this mid-tone contrast and helping to separate those elements in the image. And finally, let's go all the way up to the high pass filter, and using that as well as the selective sharpening, we may well be going a little bit too far. Let's leave that on and let's zoom back to full screen view, and with a few tonal adjustments and a little bit of color manipulation on the image, we now have an image that is absolutely crisp and clean. Let's zoom into some of the background and have a look at that. Again, zooming into 50%, we've got a lot of fine details in the background. Let's go back and look at it without any adjustments from Lightroom or Photoshop, and even though it was critically focused, it doesn't appear as sharp. It looks a little bit soft, a little bit lacking in detail, and if we apply all of those settings, all of a sudden this image comes to life. And this image could be printed to a very large size and just really leap out of the page because it is so sharp and so crisp. Okay, we've looked at how we can enhance our image by sharpening in both Lightroom and Photoshop, but what about when we want to output these images? Now, we've basically got two options. We could output them at a size suitable for displaying on the web, or we can output them as a print, and we'll be covering the treatment of images for printing in a separate video. But let's first look at how we might export this image now in a form that could be viewed on the web. Now, the first way to do that might be to use Lightroom, and let's just say that we were going to output this image to the web. We would use the output or export option within Lightroom. Let's just say we're going to put it on the desktop, and typically you're going to put it into a format for a JPEG for the web, and you will have a choice then of either Adobe RGB color space or sRGB color space, and we will, let's say we're going to resize it to high definition resolution, which would be much higher than you would normally use on the web, but in this example we're going to use this to export. Now, the critical thing here is to make sure that when you are resampling this image that we tick this box that says sharpen, and you want to sharpen it for the screen because it's going to be displayed on a computer screen on the web. And when you do that and export that image, it will save it as a JPEG with those settings. Now, the important question here is this any different from doing it from within Photoshop? So let's have a look. Let's cancel out of that, and I have prepared this separately, and let's have a look. Here is our original image, beautiful fine detail, and here is a version that I made exporting from Photoshop by going into the image and image size dialog box and setting it to an equivalent resolution for high definition, 1620 by 1080 being the critical measurement here, and I've applied no further output sharpening to this, and you can see now that viewed at 100% it's lost a bit of information. And if we then looked at the version we created by exporting from Lightroom, it's actually, with that extra step of output sharpening, it's retained much more detail than the version from exporting from Photoshop. And it's important to use the Lightroom export option, as it's a simpler and quicker and more accurate way to export and still retain a lot of that detail. Just remembering that if we go back to our original image size and if we look at the size of that image in terms of pixels, this is 8000 by 5500, 40 odd megapixels, and by reducing it to a web size image it is less than 2 megapixels. So we are actually discarding well over 90% of the image information when we export for display on the web. So it's critical then that we export it and resharpen that image for display on the web. Now this is at high definition or equivalent resolution. For the web you would probably go even smaller, and it's important then to resample that image and sharpen it appropriately for display on the web. And if we go back to look at our original file, and if we wanted to print this, we will cover the printing options in a separate video because there are a number of different options we need to consider. But if we just looked at our print size, and if we're working with an Epson printer, we want to send the information to the printer at 360 pixels per inch. And if you're using a Canon printer, you want 300 pixels per inch. If you send it either less or more than that, the printer will interpolate that file and reduce the image resolution or add pixels that you don't need. So let's just look at millimeters for people in the Western world. This print could be printed at 582 by 388 millimeters at that resolution, which makes for a very large print. Or if you're in the North American part of the world and you work in inches, it's going to be a 22 or 23 inch print. So quite a sizable print at full resolution, and that's without doing any further work for the output sharpening and resampling that we will cover in a separate video. So remembering, if you're going to display an image on the web and resample it to a smaller size, you need to add some extra output sharpening, and for printing we have some other tricks we can apply to enhance the print quality on output. So in summary, sharpening your images is a critical step in the image making process if you have an image that has fine detail. Again, if you have an image that is a deliberately soft image or blurry image, sharpening is not critical. But for any image that has fine detail in it, you need to apply the appropriate sharpening, and we've demonstrated these techniques in this video. So please come back again and look at our further videos, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.